So first we'll do introduction, friction introduction. So what is friction? This is we'll discuss. So you could see that this person was sliding on the surface. So why this person was sliding on this surface? Because the surface was not having sufficiently large friction. So you can see how important the friction is. It comes at everywhere in day-to-day life. So everything would just keep slipping and falling all over the places if there was no friction. So friction prevents the uncontrolled motion of the objects. So you could see this person was sliding. Why? Because the friction was not there on the surface. Okay. So what is friction? So friction is a force by virtue of which it opposes the relative motion when a body moves or tends to move with respect to other body. So we have two objects together, two objects under consideration. If one object in contact with other object is trying to move relative to one object is trying to move with respect to other, then the friction force appears. That force opposes the relative motion. Okay, so we have two objects. And if one object is trying to move against other, the friction will try to prevent that relative motion. So how that happens? So if we consider one object is here, another object is here. Okay, if the above one is trying to go in forward direction, suppose it is pulled in forward direction with some force. So this upper object A is trying to go in forward direction with respect to lower object B. So what will happen? Since the upper object is trying to move forward with respect to B, there will be friction force acting in backward direction, opposite to the direction of intended motion or actual motion, whatever. In many cases, the object may not move. So intended, we say in that case it is intended motion. So, and some cases it may move. And the A is trying to go forward with respect to B, so friction is backward. And if you see for B, B is trying to go backward with respect to A, so friction will be acting forward on B. Okay, so these two are Newton's third law pair. These two friction on A and B are Newton's third law pair. Since A is trying to go forward, with respect to B, the friction force will act backward, and B is trying to go backward with respect to A, the friction force will be forward. Okay. Now we can see what is written here. A body in motion comes to rest due to opposing forces acting between the body. So as moving on B, the opposing forces, the friction will stop that motion, will try to stop that motion. Okay, so that is friction. The component of contact force parallel to surface in contact is friction. So that we have already discussed that friction is what? Friction is the component of contact force. So if you consider this one, the contact force is what? Between these two surfaces. So one contact force is normal and another is friction. So both are part of contact force. So that is the thing we are saying, the component of contact force parallel to surface. You can see this friction is parallel to contact surface. Okay, so that is the thing we were discussing. So what you could see here is this ball was moving on the surface, and when the surface is rough, you can see this surface is rough, the friction is more, the ball slowed down, and when the surface is smooth, the ball was moving faster. So the amount of friction produced during the process depends on the texture of both the surfaces. Both means the lower surface as well as the surface of the ball. Okay, so this both decides how much will be the friction force. So these things we are going to discuss in detail. Okay, so if we consider a bicycle when you want to stop a bicycle, you press the brake and it slows down because of the friction between the brakes and the wheel. Okay, so you can see in this diagram, when you apply the brake, this blue one, this is the brake pad. This brake pad will come in contact with the wheel and therefore it stops. Okay, so the friction is what? Friction is the force between these two, and that stops the bicycle. So you can see how important the friction is in day-to-day life. Okay, so different solid objects experience different amount of friction. An eraser on a glass top table will experience more friction than a coin. So on a glass top table, if you keep an eraser, okay, so eraser is made up of rubber, so that produces a large amount of friction. Rubber has generally large friction. And if you keep a coin, the coin will have much less friction on a glass surface. And if you put an ice cube will have even lesser friction. So that is due to what? Because ice cube is what? Made up of water. So water melts beneath the cube, and that is something liquid. So liquid has even much less friction. So because of that, the whole ice cube is having much lesser friction. Okay, so why do you slip and fall when the floor has been just mopped? So the reason is, when it is mopped, there is a small thin layer of water present on the surface. And since water is liquid, it produces much less friction. And that friction, less amount of friction, results into the falling. So this is because liquid creates a thin layer between the floor and your shoes, and it reduces the friction a lot. Okay. We observe many accidents during monsoon because of less friction between the road and the tire. The road and the tire will have very small amount of friction during the rainy season, and that is the reason of skidding of the vehicle and accidents. And if you go to the hilly regions where you have ice on the surface, that is even very much more dangerous than even monsoon roads. If you go to any roads on hilly region, in those places you have the ice or you have snowfall on the road, and that snow is what? That is very much slippery. So it is very difficult to apply the brakes. So in many of the countries, when there is a snowfall, there will be strict warning for driving on the roads. Okay, now we will see causes of friction. So what is the cause of friction? So irregularity on surface makes depression and elevation. So if you consider any surface, suppose you consider this surface. Okay, this is okay. If you consider this surface, if you consider this surface here, you can see that the upper object and lower object. So there is some irregularities on the surface. So there are some interlocking between these two surfaces because of the irregularity on both the surfaces. Okay, so you can see the interlocking. There is the part from the upper one. There are the parts from the upper one which is going on the lower part. So this is interlocking the lower surface. So this is the main reason for the friction. Okay, here this is the main reason for friction. So there is interlocking between these different surfaces. So that leads to the what? That leads to the friction. So it looks as two surfaces interlock each other. Due to this interlocking motion, one body over another body is restricted. The motion of one body over another body is restricted. You cannot move it that easily. Okay, so friction is generally less if surfaces are smooth. If surfaces are smooth, friction is less. But if surfaces are completely smooth, means irregularities on the surface are completely removed, then again friction increases. How? Because see, initially we saw that there are some irregularity on the surface, so that is the reason for friction. Now if you remove it completely, the two surfaces will come very close to each other. They will be perfectly in contact, and in that case the molecules and atoms on two sides, they will start exerting the adhesive forces on each other, and because of that, what will happen? They will have even larger friction. Okay, so if the surfaces are identical in nature, suppose glass over glass, and are very smooth, the cohesive forces increase, and that increases the friction. So even if they are not identical, even in that case, some forces come. But so the main thing to understand here is, if we have two surfaces made perfectly smooth, then the friction is not going to be zero. Even in that case, and actually if it is perfectly smooth, friction even increases. And the reason is the molecules on two sides come very close to each other because of the reduced irregularity. They come very close to each other, and because of that, they form the weak bonds, and the force increases, the friction force increases. Work done in overcoming friction results into heating. Okay, so if you are rubbing something, if you rub your hands, if you rub your two hands, you find that after some time it gets heated. So why it is heated? Because of friction. So if you have to do some work to overcome the friction, you have to apply some external force to overcome friction. So that work goes in heating of the surfaces. Okay, now we come to value of friction. So value of friction depends on the nature of surface. So if you consider the ice surface, the value of friction will be less. If you consider the rubber surface, the value of friction is high. Okay, and it also depends on the normal force between surfaces. So what is the meaning of normal force? So I am giving you an example. If you hold a soap in your hand, a wet soap, so that is difficult to hold in your hand. If a soap is wet, it is difficult to hold in your hand. Why it is difficult? Because it is wet and the friction is reduced. And if you hold it very lightly, the soap may slide down. But if you apply very large force, if you hold it very tightly, so very tightly means you are applying large normal force on the soap. You are applying very large normal force on the soap. So when you apply very large normal force on the soap, you are increasing the friction. So how the surface is pressed against each other, that also decides the friction, not only the type of surface. So if I say this is one surface and this is one of it, this is another. If you push it with very large force in this direction, there will be very strong normal force developed here, and this strong normal force will result into large friction between these two. So if you press it in this direction, it will be difficult to move the object even in parallel direction to the surface. Why? Because there will be a large normal force developed on the surface. So the friction depends on the type of surface, and it also depends on the normal between the surfaces.